What if the food your grandparents survived on was quietly erased from history? Not by accident, but by health departments, immigration officials, and food safety boards who looked at ancient Chinese culinary traditions and called them dangerous, called them primitive, called them wrong. Today, we are counting down 25 Chinese meals from the 1960s that were banned, forbidden, or heavily suppressed, and the survival stories behind every single one of them will leave you speechless. Before we begin our countdown, a brief note. The following stories are presented for historical and educational purposes only. We are documenting the cultural practices and survival strategies of a specific era. This content is not intended as medical or nutritional advice, nor is it an endorsement of these practices today. Now, let's begin. Number 25. Century eggs with fermented black beans. In the early 1960s, Chinese families in cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou were rationing everything they had. The Great Leap Forward had created devastating food shortages, and century eggs, preserved duck, chicken, or quail eggs, cured in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, quicklime, and rice hulls for weeks to months, became a critical protein source in households that had almost nothing left. When Chinese immigrants brought this tradition to cities like San Francisco and New York, American health inspectors were horrified. The eggs looked wrong. They smelled wrong. The greenish-gray yolk and dark translucent white triggered immediate concern, and the Food and Drug Administration, alongside various state health boards, flagged them as potentially hazardous, targeting the lead content in some traditional preparation methods. What those officials missed entirely was the fact that Chinese families had been safely consuming these eggs for centuries. Modern nutritional analysis has confirmed that properly prepared century eggs contain meaningful amounts of protein, iron, and selenium. The banning did not stop grandmothers from making them in kitchen corners where nobody was watching. Number 24. Salted fish rice porridge. Cantonese families called it juk or congee, but the version that got flagged by Western health officials was the one soaked with heavily salted preserved fish. During the 1960s in Hong Kong and southern China, this was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner for working-class families. The salt-preserved fish, often made at home without refrigeration, alarmed Western food safety inspectors who associated it with botulism risk. Several Chinese restaurants in the United Kingdom and Australia during the mid-1960s were actually ordered to remove home-fermented salted fish dishes from their menus entirely. What they were banning was a survival meal that had fed generations of coastal Chinese communities through floods, famines, and wars. The high salt content acted as its own preservative in the absence of refrigeration, which was precisely the point. Number 23. Dog meat hot pot. This is the one that will divide opinion, but the historical record is undeniable. In parts of rural China and in certain Chinese communities in Southeast Asia during the 1960s, dog meat was consumed, particularly during winter months when it was believed to generate body heat. Chinese traditional medicine, rooted in thousands of years of practice, categorized dog meat as having warming properties beneficial in cold conditions. When this practice became visible to Western audiences through immigration and early food journalism in the 1960s, the backlash was immediate. Multiple Western countries passed localized ordinances specifically targeting the sale or preparation of dog meat in immigrant communities. Survival context matters here enormously. In post-war and famine-era China, protein was protein, and families did what they had to do. Number 22. Pig-brain congee. Considered a delicacy in 1960s Sichuan province, pig-brain congee was also a survival food for elderly people who needed soft, easily digestible nutrition when other food was scarce. Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners prescribed it for cognitive support and energy restoration. When this dish appeared in Chinese community restaurants in Western countries during the early 1960s, health officials raised concerns about prion disease risk. And though this was before prion diseases were fully understood by science, the precautionary bans came quickly. Families continued making it privately because grandparents who had survived decades of hardship trusted the food that had kept them alive far more than they trusted a foreign government pamphlet. Number 21. Bitter melon and pork blood soup. The combination of bitter melon and fresh pork blood in a clear broth was a staple in Hakka communities throughout the 1960s. Pork blood was cheap, accessible, and packed with iron, critical nutrition for communities experiencing significant poverty. In China during the early 1960s, when meat rationing was severe and ration coupons determined what a family could legally obtain, pork blood from local slaughterhouses often fell outside the rationing system entirely, making it freely available to those who knew to ask for it. In Western immigrant communities, the dish was banned from commercial sale in multiple states and provinces due to concerns about blood-borne contamination. Families served it at home because it kept children from becoming anemic when nothing else could. Number 20. Snake soup. Guangdong province has a centuries-old tradition of snake soup, and during the 1960s, particularly during the harsh winters when food was scarce, snake meat provided essential protein that other sources simply could not supply. Snake soup vendors in Hong Kong during the 1960s were legendary figures in their neighborhoods, operating from steaming cauldrons in night markets. When Chinese restaurants began serving it in Western cities, wildlife protection regulations became a convenient mechanism to shut the practice down, with health codes layered on top. The soup itself, typically made with multiple varieties of snake, shredded chicken, and various mushrooms, is rich in protein and was genuinely believed to warm the body and improve circulation. Modern studies on snake-derived compounds have validated some of these traditional claims. Number 19. Fermented shrimp paste rice. Shrimp paste, known as hai-ko in some dialects, has a smell so powerful it was once described by a Western food inspector in 1963 as a public health emergency. The fermented paste, made from tiny shrimp packed with salt and left to mature in the sun, was a foundational flavor ingredient for millions of Chinese and Southeast Asian families in the 1960s. Health departments in several Australian cities specifically issued warnings about the importation and sale of fermented shrimp products during this era, citing bacterial content concerns. What the inspectors failed to acknowledge was that the fermentation process itself, ancient and carefully calibrated, was doing exactly what refrigeration does for modern food. Recent microbiome research has highlighted fermented shrimp products as a source of beneficial bacterial compounds. Number 18. Monkey brain. This is perhaps the most genuinely controversial entry on this list, and the historical evidence suggests it was practiced in isolated and specific regional contexts in southern China, not as a widespread mainstream meal. During the 1960s, in extremely impoverished rural communities, no part of any animal was wasted. Monkey was hunted and consumed in jungle-adjacent provinces, with the brain considered the most nutritionally valuable part. Western media coverage of this practice in the mid-1960s was sensationalized and often inaccurate, but it resulted in blanket prohibitions against the preparation or sale of primate-derived foods in virtually every Western jurisdiction that had Chinese immigrant populations. Number 17. Raw liver dumplings. In northern China during the 1960s, when winters were brutal and food shortages were at their most acute, raw liver from pigs or chickens was sometimes mixed with garlic, ginger, and grain flours and formed into dumpling-style preparations. The liver was considered medicinal, high in iron and vitamin A, and traditional Chinese medicine actively recommended it for treating what was described as blood deficiency. Western food authorities were unequivocal in their condemnation, with raw pork liver specifically flagged as a salmonella and hepatitis a risk. The families making these dumplings were not operating in ignorance. They were working with what they had, applying generational knowledge to stretch limited nutrition as far as it could possibly go. Number 16. Stinky tofu. Few foods triggered more immediate regulatory responses in Western cities than stinky tofu. When Chinese immigrants began fermenting tofu in the traditional way, submerging it in a brine that could include fermented milk, vegetables, and meat, then leaving it to develop for months, neighbors complained, landlords complained, and health inspectors arrived. In multiple documented cases in 1960s New York and London, stinky tofu preparation was cited under nuisance laws and food safety codes. The irony is significant when you consider that aged cheese, A product that goes through an almost identical microbial transformation process, was simultaneously celebrated as sophisticated cuisine. The tofu that got people's grandparents in legal trouble is now studied for its probiotic properties. Number 15. Silkworm pupae stir-fry. Protein was the great scarcity of 1960s China, and silkworm pupae, the byproduct of silk production in provinces like Jiangsu and Zhejiang, provided a cheap, available, and nutritionally dense solution. Stir-fried with garlic, soy, and chili, silkworm pupae were eaten regularly in silk-producing regions and became comfort food for migrants who carried the tradition with them. Western countries largely classified insect-based foods as categorically unsuitable for human consumption during this era, and the sale of silkworm pupae was banned or heavily restricted in most European and North American food codes. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization would spend the next several decades trying to tell the Western world that insects are one of the most sustainable and nutritious protein sources on Earth. Number 14. Turtle soup with herbs. Soft-shell turtle soup was a prestigious dish in 1960s China, but it was also a practical survival food in regions where turtles were accessible in rivers and ponds. The soup was simmered for hours with goji berries, Chinese dates, and medicinal herbs, creating a broth that traditional practitioners prescribed for weakness, recovery from illness, and general fortification. When Chinese restaurants in the United States began serving it in the 1960s, animal protection ordinances began to specifically target turtle preparation. The combination of wildlife regulations and food safety codes effectively banned the dish from commercial preparation in most Western jurisdictions by the late 1960s. Number 13. Fermented black soybeans with rice. Black soybeans fermented in salt, known as dushi, were used by poorer Chinese families in the 1960s as a primary protein and flavoring source when fresh meat was completely unavailable. A bowl of plain rice with a spoonful of these intensely savory fermented beans could sustain a working adult through a full day of labor. Western food inspectors who encountered dushi in immigrant communities during the 1960s flagged the high sodium content and the unfamiliar fermentation profile as potential hazards. Several community kitchens and informal food operations run by Chinese immigrants were specifically ordered to stop serving dishes featuring homemade fermented black beans. The science of fermentation has since established dushi as a source of beneficial microorganisms, natokinase-related compounds, and significant amino acid content. Number 12. Scorpion wine. In traditional Chinese medicine practice throughout the 1960s, scorpions infused in rice wine were prescribed for pain relief, joint problems, and what practitioners described as wind-related conditions in the body. In rural communities where pharmaceutical medicine was entirely inaccessible, this was real medicine. Families kept jars of scorpion wine in dark cupboards for emergencies. When this practice became visible to Western authorities through immigration and trade, alcohol regulatory bodies and health departments in Western countries moved quickly to ban the import and preparation of any alcohol containing animal matter under food safety classifications. Modern pharmacological research has since isolated active compounds in scorpion venom that have legitimate analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties. Number 11. Frog porridge. In southern China and among Cantonese communities during the 1960s, frog, particularly paddy frog, abundant in rice fields, was a critical protein source for farming families who had no access to conventional meat through the rationing system. Frog porridge, slow-cooked with ginger and spring onion, was gentle enough for sick family members and nutritionally substantial enough for working adults. Western food codes in the 1960s were deeply inconsistent about frog meat. French cuisine featuring frog legs was welcomed in fine dining establishments, while Chinese frog preparations faced health code scrutiny and in several cases outright bans in commercial kitchens. Number 10. Dried caterpillar fungus broth. Cordyceps, the parasitic fungus that grows on caterpillar larvae in high-altitude regions of Tibet and Yunnan, was used by Chinese families in the 1960s as a medicinal broth ingredient for elderly relatives experiencing weakness and respiratory difficulty. A single dried caterpillar fungus in a broth of chicken or pork was enough to be considered a meaningful health intervention. Western pharmaceutical regulators in the 1960s were deeply suspicious of any preparation involving insect-derived materials, and cordyceps products were frequently seized at customs and banned from commercial sale. Modern sports science and immunology research has since produced hundreds of peer-reviewed studies on cordyceps compounds confirming meaningful biological activity. Number 9. Ox penis soup. Traditional Chinese medicine in the 1960s operated on a principle of like treating like, and ox penis soup was prescribed specifically for male vitality and kidney energy restoration. In rural communities where pharmaceutical alternatives did not exist, this was a genuine medical intervention that families took seriously. Western food authorities found this categorically unacceptable, and the sale of any sexual organ-derived animal product was banned from commercial food preparation in most Western jurisdictions by various public decency and food safety clauses during the 1960s. Number 8. Rat meat stew. In provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi, and documented in historical accounts of the Great Chinese Famine period extending into the early 1960s, rat meat was consumed not as exotic novelty, but as pure survival necessity. Families that had lost access to any other meat source hunted rice paddy rats, which fed on grain and were considered relatively clean by traditional standards. The meat was stewed with strong aromatics to reduce its gamey quality. In Western contexts, any preparation involving rat meat was immediately classified under public health emergency categories, and documented cases exist of Chinese immigrants facing legal consequences for attempting to continue this practice. Number 7. Blood tofu. Congealed pig or duck blood pressed into blocks, blood tofu, was a staple of 1960s Chinese cooking across many regions. In Sichuan hot pot, in Hunan stews, in simple soups eaten by families with almost nothing else available. Blood tofu provided iron in quantities that no affordable plant food could match. In Western countries, congealed blood products faced sweeping prohibitions in commercial kitchen regulations. British food safety codes in the 1960s specifically listed preparations of congealed animal blood as restricted items. The families who kept making it at home were protecting their children from iron deficiency in the only way available to them. Number 6. Sheep eyeball soup. Considered medicinal for vision support in traditional Chinese practice, and eaten in Western Chinese regions including Xinjiang, where cultural exchange with Central Asian traditions had long normalized the consumption of all animal parts. Sheep eyeball soup was absolutely foreign to Western palates and regulatory. Number 2. Placenta broth. Traditional Chinese postpartum practice in the 1960s included the preparation of human placenta, ziheche in traditional medicine terminology, as a restorative broth for new mothers who had experienced significant blood loss during delivery. This was not superstition. Ziheche had been recorded in Chinese medical texts for centuries as a treatment for weakness, insufficient lactation, and blood deficiency. In Western medical and legal frameworks of the 1960s, consuming human-derived biological material of any kind fell into deeply prohibited territory, both under food safety law and increasingly under biomedical ethics frameworks. Families who continued this practice did so entirely in private. Number 1. Whole roasted dog with 5 spice. The most banned, most condemned, and most misunderstood meal on this entire list is also the one with the most complex survival story attached to it. In the Yulin tradition and in other parts of southern China and the Korean-Chinese border communities of northeastern China, dog meat consumption during winter months was embedded in cultural and medicinal tradition, dating back well beyond the 20th century. During the great hardships of the early 1960s, food rationing, famine conditions in certain provinces, the collapse of agricultural output following collectivization failures, families in these communities relied on dog meat as a critical winter protein source. The 5-spice preparation was not casual. It was ceremonial, traditional, and deliberate. Western governments and advocacy groups moved aggressively to ban any commercial preparation of dog meat in immigrant communities throughout the 1960s, and the cultural erasure that followed was swift and thorough. The survival stories connected to this meal are the most painful to hear and the most important to understand in their full historical context. These were not people making shocking choices for entertainment. These were grandparents keeping their children alive. That is the truth behind all 25 of these meals. The banning was real, the survival was real, and the knowledge those grandparents carried deserves to be treated with the complexity and respect it has always been owed. If this history surprised you, share it with someone who needs to understand where our food phobias actually come from. And if your own family has a survival food story connected to any of these, leave it in the comments below. Those stories deserve to be heard.